Warami, Nagaya Susan, Nagaya Grinjiwawunga, Gumidapiyanga, Gumida Wangara, Matamarong Tianaga Anaga, Matamarong Bialia, Gadigal, Guri Pemel. Hello, I'm Susan, I'm Grinjiwawunga. On behalf of all of us here, with honour and respect, I ask to speak to the male spirits, I ask to speak to the female spirits, for us to walk and talk and celebrate on the land of the Gadigal people. I've travelled this afternoon from Gumaragal Country, Northern Sydney, across the waterways to Gadigal Country to be with you this afternoon. And I thank Professor Dennis Foley, who gifted me those words to speak this afternoon, as I'm a Grinjiwawunga woman from the Northern Territory, and as yesterday was Sorry Day, I'm part of the stolen generation, so I don't know the language that I was born into. I've been taught language of this country in Sydney where I've been raised, so I'm incredibly grateful to be able to do that. So I thank Professor Foley for his cultural gifts that he continues to give us. I'd also like to thank the very kind invitation to be able to speak this afternoon to do the Acknowledgement of Country, which I always take such pride in being able to do, to represent us as First Nations people of this land. And the protocol is to acknowledge country if you don't have bloodlines to country, which I don't. My ancestral homelands are in the Northern Territory. It's the 30th anniversary of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. And with that celebration, it's time to transform. And we are, as the original people of this land, we want to transform with you. Transform how we live in a more sustainable way on this continent. We are the oldest living culture on the planet, and that's something of significance and something that we celebrate, and we hope that all of you who call yourselves Australians will celebrate with us, because we are a part of Australia. Even though my DNA and my ancestry predates what we know as Australia, there are times when we are proud to stand side by side, and there are times when there is deep sadness and regret about the history of this continent. We are the caretakers, we are the custodians, and we are the guardians of the planet. There are things that we can teach you. We have the oldest economic systems on the planet. There are things we can teach you. We need to find the balance, harmony, and alignment. We believe that there are three worlds. There's the human world, the sacred world, and the physical world, the environment. When we live understanding those three worlds, then we can find that balance in life. It's a bit like the three-legged stool. Take one of those pillars away and it simply falls over. Our connection to country, our connection to our kin, and connection to the ancestors in the sacred world is what gives us deep meaning and purpose in life. We need to transform how we think and how we behave towards each other and to ourselves. That is what I hope that the Gumaragal Group and I can bring to the Council as a new member, to be a conduit between communities and businesses, to weave together the Western system and the original system. The time for transformation is now. I want to curate cultural knowledge and connect the two worlds that I live and move between. We are the original people of this land, and we have something of value to offer. Untapped potential that you need to be open to see it and to respect it, and then to be a part of it. The truth will not only set you free, it will transform. The truth is that now is the time to transform. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Moylan-Coombs. Would you please now welcome to the stage Dr John Hewson, Chair of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to deliver the Fiona Wain Oration on the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. Let me begin, though, by my own acknowledgement of country. Pay my respects to the first Australians and their elders, past, present and emerging. And thank my good friend Susan Moylan-Coombs for her acknowledgement of country. As a personal point, I'd just like to say that we're going to talk a lot today about transformation and transition and significant structural change in the way we do business and the way we operate as a society. But we still have this glaring failure of not having addressed the legacy of the first Australians, the contribution of the first Australians, the proper recognition of the first Australians in our Constitution, a voice to Parliament, and having done and actually genuinely solved the problem of Indigenous disadvantage in this country. So I suggest that after 250 years, it's about time that transformation took place. It's also an honour for me to speak in memory of Fiona Wain. In my experience with Fiona, one word comes to mind, a word that I feel defined her, and that is passion. Fiona had a genuine passion for sustainability long before it gained the currency that it has today. The need to transform systems is the concept that everyone in sustainability is now talking about. As my old nemesis Paul Keating would have said, all the glass in the pet shop are now talking about transformation to ensure sustainability. The challenge now is to back it up with action. It is literally now or never as far as that action is concerned. I've been a sustainability and climate activist since the late 1980s. Indeed, as a federal opposition in that period, we were advocating a cut in emissions of about 20% by the year 2000 off a 1990 base. And that was with the broad support of both parties in the coalition, a novelty these days. However, today I lament how if we'd achieved those reductions in those 3 decades since, that we'd already be at less than half our Paris commitment in terms of emissions reduction. Let me repeat that. We'd be at less than half our Paris commitments already if we'd actually embraced that challenge 3 decades ago. And our nation would have benefited from billions of dollars of investment and growth and seen hundreds of thousands of jobs. With the exception of 2007, when Rudd and Howard actually agreed on an emissions trading scheme, and with the exception of Gillard's short run with a carbon price, the decades have simply been squandered by short-term political point scoring and blame shifting. This oration is being given against a very disappointing and challenging background. While recent months have seen a resumption of momentum in the debate about climate and the urgency of response, mostly driven, I guess, by Biden and his climate envoy, John Kerry, putting pressure, encouraging increased commitments beyond those offered at Paris, and driven to some extent by Boris Johnson and his desire to define COP26, to lead the world through COP26. Unfortunately, it's still the case that the magnitude and urgency of the climate challenge is yet to be fully recognised by any government, policy authority or business, let alone be responded to effectively and fairly. As John Kerry said recently in his trip to Europe, he pointed out that if all the 195 countries that signed the Paris Agreement actually met those commitments, the world would still warm by about 3.7 degrees centigrade, which is a staggering set of circumstances for us to be talking about these issues today, as background to the issues we're discussing today. Similarly, neither has the enormity of the global and domestic financing task for these essential transitions been fully recognised, both in aggregate and in distribution between the rich and poor nations. And embarrassingly, Australia has been tagged as a global laggard in terms of our response. We received the lowest ranking out of 57 countries surveyed in the 2020 Climate Change Performance Index, for example, and ranked second worst on climate action out of 177 countries in the 2020 UN Sustainable Development Report. And finally, though, the costs of inaction are being accepted as far exceeding the transaction costs of decisive action and transition. However, rather than just get despondent about these realities, I think it's time to recognise the enormous opportunities for Australia and for Australian businesses based on our many, I think, enviable national assets to be a world leader in the essential transitions across all sectors, as well as an energy and technology exporter. In many ways, the COVID pandemic has been a very instructive dress rehearsal for just how rapidly and decisively we can respond with the right leadership and collaboration across government, business and community. We can do it together to accept the magnitude and urgency of the challenges and work constructively and collaboratively to meet them. Just pause to reflect on how rapidly we have changed the way we work, the way we travel, how we spend, what we save, how we entertain and so on, and how quickly our governments and institutions have adjusted in just the last 12 months or so. Our future in these circumstances, to my mind, should only be limited by our imagination. Unfortunately, even as some 110 countries have now formally adopted a net zero target for 2050, together with a host of states and cities and businesses and civil society organisations, the Morrison government is yet to formally commit to net zero by 2050. Worse still, while they dangle the possibility of committing, they persist in sending signals and making announcements that are quite inconsistent with a genuine commitment to that sort of target. The government is also yet to recognise that their headline announcement of a commitment to net zero by 2050 would be absolutely meaningless without recognition that such a target necessitates about a 60% cut in emissions by 2030. We simply can't stick with the Paris commitment of 26 to 28% by 2030 to be credible, if they want their commitment to net zero by 2050 to be seen as genuine. To date, of course, they haven't been at all genuine. Just in recent days, the government has embarked on a troika of bizarre and frankly backward-looking announcements. They blocked financing for a wind farm in preference to a coal-fired power plant in Queensland. They broadened ARENA's mandate to include gas. They misrepresented the need for and deliberately delayed the transition to electric vehicles. They've locked us into dirty petrol for the next 7 years and announced funding for a $600 million, 660 megawatt gas-fired power plant in the Hunter. The last decision lacks any rationale or any economic logic. Associate Professor Ariel Liebman at the Monash Energy Institute, Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University, has argued that it is clear that such a project could not achieve the intended objectives of the electricity market and its many stakeholders to deliver the long-term interest of Australians in three key ways. First, it would increase carbon dioxide emissions by 5 million metric tonnes of CO2 over 20 years to 2042-43. Secondly, the investment of the gas-fired power would also increase total electricity costs by about $70 million per year, with total system costs over the period to 2043 increased by up to $1,011 million. And thirdly, the project would reduce Snowy Hydro's net profit, the body being commissioned to build this power station, by up to $3.38 million over the same period. Nevertheless, it's worth challenging Minister Taylor to release his business case, his feasibility study, as distinct from his political case for the decision that's been taken in relation to that new gas-fired power station in the Hunter. So from an economic, investment and environmental perspective, that project fails. You could almost call it the, I can't say this word, hydroxychloroquine solution on climate action. It is scientifically and technically compromised and socially harmful. It will create all of about 10 jobs when operating, according to the recently released reports, and has no economic logic according to even the government's own major energy advisors. The government's claim that its strategy is technology, not taxes, and that it is technology not agnostic. The government claims that it is technology, not taxes, and that it is technology agnostic. But sticking with old gas technology against overwhelming evidence that renewables are now much cheaper and more reliable belies the argument. The argument that gas is a necessary transition is outdated by technological development. I remember when 30 years ago we proposed gas as a transition fuel, it was at a time where solar and wind were extremely expensive. Now they're incredibly cheap, and the case for a transition via gas to simply partially reduce emissions is no longer valid. You'd have to ask the question, why is it that the South Australian Liberal government could put in place battery storage which addresses intermittent energy needs, and that costs a fraction of the price and reduced wholesale price, and it has reduced wholesale energy prices. What we need is a new roadmap, and one that doesn't keep taking U-turns. The government's announcement of this gas-fired power station coincided with an International Energy Agency report warning that new and some existing gas and coal infrastructure will become redundant if the world meets net zero carbon pollution reduction targets. Several important points should be noted from this report. First, it should be recognised that the IEA was originally a mouthpiece for the fossil fuel, that's the oil, coal and gas industries, so the report rates as a Damascus Road conversion. Indeed, I've been told that the report itself was actually passed across some of these big polluters before it was published. Second, the language from the global body is stark. It's very stark in tone, referring to the climate crisis as needing a singular, unwavering focus from all governments, working together with one another and with businesses, investors and citizens. The report also stresses, and I quote, "There is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. This reflects a radical departure from the previous publications that were more moderated and focused on energy stability." Third, the report details a long list of specific quantitative actions across multiple sectors required to achieve this pathway. In many cases, these are dramatically different from current actions and plans. For example, no new oil or gas fields or coal mines from this year, or a 60% global sales target for passenger cars by 2030. The impact of choosing these actions is balanced against the need for energy security and ensuring a just and fair transition. And fourth, the report said for the first time, the world has now been given a plan, a checklist with hundreds of milestones to assess progress in the highest emitting sectors. I think you'll find there will be calls for the IEA to incorporate this pathway in their base case modelling, excuse me, and to develop detailed analyses for countries and companies. But probably this will of course be resisted by our government. In short, this is what I would call a stunning gap. There is what I would call a stunning gap between where the energy sector is and where it needs to be. And while this net zero pathway is feasible, the IEA's chief economic analyst says it's very, very narrow. And he would also emphasise the urgency of pursuing that pathway. This landmark report of the Global Energy Agency comes at a crucial moment, ahead of crucial G7 and G20 meetings, which will show leaders what immediate action needs to be taken to align with the 1.5 degrees centigrade in net zero goals. It should be noted that in the run-up to these meetings of the G7, countries are already committed to phase out fossil fuel financing, starting with coal-fired power plants by the end of this year. As the World Business Council for Sustainable Development President and CEO Peter Backer said in response to the release of the report, there is clearly an enormous gap between the current global plans and actions and those needed. But for the first time, we can clearly see the size of the challenge and the action plan that we have to adopt. To further set the government's boast about its focus on technology in context, it's worth making a couple of further points. First, the IEA Pathway Report argued that energy transformation will be based on solar, wind, bioenergy and hydrogen. About 85% of the required transition through to 2030 will be based on existing proven technologies, and about 50% to then reach the net zero 2050 target. So the Morrison government is wrong to create the impression that the transition must await technology development. We not only have the enviable endowments of solar, wind and other key elements, but we have the proven technologies to exploit and store them, as with bioenergy and now hydrogen. There is simply no excuse on technology grounds for delaying the transition to renewables. The second point I'd make is that a recent report from the European Patent Office and the International Energy Agency, published late last month, that's in April, reviewed the innovation trends across the energy system and low carbon energy in particular. It found that clean energy transitions are being built using innovations that represent a departure from the types of technologies developed by the energy sector in previous decades. Since 2017, most of the growth in low carbon energy related patents has been connected to batteries, hydrogen, smart grids, as well as carbon capture, utilisation and storage. All important enablers, of course, of the energy transition. And more than half of all low carbon energy patents across the past 5 years have been connected to fuel switching and energy efficiency technologies. Worryingly, particularly for the accuracy of Minister Taylor's recent statements about Australia leading the world, is that the World Economic Forum's latest Global Innovation Index shows that Australia is dragging its feet when it comes to innovation. Not only are our major trading partners competing aggressively in the race to zero carbon emissions, but we haven't got out of the changing room by comparison. Those economies doing well in innovation stakes are effectively translating costly innovation investments into more and higher quality outputs. Australia produces less innovation outputs relative to its level of innovation investments, so we need to be smarter if we want to get bang for our buck. This means that having an understanding of the environment that we now conduct our business in and how it is changing. The IEA Pathway Report is incredibly disturbing in one sense, but exciting in another. It indicates directions for hope, only this time it's not just a report. It's rather an extremely well-articulated, documented and utterly motivating call for action. It creates a unique opportunity for business to lead what will be an unparalleled industrial revolution, especially where governments such as ours duck and dither, especially while governments such as ours duck and dither. The Industrial Revolution will be unique in terms of the great speed with which new ideas and technologies are spreading around the world. Every company across every industry is now compelled to reconsider their traditional ways of doing business to keep pace with the rapidly changing technology and consumer expectations. The particular challenge for each business is to focus on its carbon footprint, especially on its use of materials, power, transport, logistics and waste, as well as the climate risks it is running across its supply chains. The Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia has responded to the need for urgent action in the way we utilise our planet. Being aligned with the World Business Council, we are working with them and our members all along the energy value chain to rise to the challenge. We have been part of a group that has developed 9 pathways which are supported by a comprehensive list of actions that businesses must take over the next decade. Given the intense debate about the sources of our energy needs, I will focus on just one of those pathways, which is energy. These opportunities are across the economy. They're global and in Australia for effective and just transition. Energy, transport, agriculture, building materials and codes, industrial processes. The actions open to business and to finance, to innovate and to invest and to transform global energy consumption and production that can be mapped across important milestone dates between now and 2050. The main, I think, milestones are first, no new oil and gas fields and no new coal mines or mine extensions, beyond those already committed from this year. Secondly, halting construction of all new coal plants this year, unless they are built with carbon capture technology. And although the latter is often pushed very hard by this government as a solution, I think it's a long way from being commercially viable in power generation without a significant carbon price. Thirdly, closing all coal-fired power stations not fitted with that carbon capture technology by 2040, a coal exit in the OECD actually by 2030. Increasing the use of renewable sources of energy from 29% in 2020 to about 90% in 2050, implementing a ban in 2025 on the sale of new oil and gas boilers to heat buildings, net zero emissions electricity in advanced economies by no later than 2050, phasing out internal combustion engine cars by 2035, including a 60% of global car sales to be electric by 2030, and conversion of vehicle fleets to either electric or hydrogen fuel sources by 2050. shifting power plants away from carbon emissions to renewable sources of energy by 2035, transitioning half of all plane travel sources to hydrogen or biofuels by 2040, and finally 70% of global electricity to be generated from solar PV and wind by 2050. In my terms, this is pretty much an energy and climate fight-back plan for the 21st century. In fact, as John Kerry has said recently, once we have the ability to do so, we need to move on from net zero. We'll need to start thinking about net negative emissions. Taking action does not mean that companies have to give up profits. About 15 years ago, I was on the board of a printing group. I had those big old heavy large printing machines, and I suggested to the surprise of my fellow directors that we should look at the climate footprint, the carbon footprint of that business. We're big users of power, transport and logistics. The review demonstrated that we could reduce our carbon footprint simply by reorganising the use of power and logistics, cutting nothing, to boost the bottom line by 25 to 30%. I was suddenly seen as a very valuable member of that board. It's the same in investment. We've had a lot of ethical investments and other related strategies where people have moved out of tobacco or fossil fuels and other things in the ESG context, I guess, more broadly, and it hasn't really affected their returns. In fact, some of these investments have done pretty well without those particular exposures, those risk exposures, especially when we create new businesses and new jobs. Reflecting this has been a significant push from the investor community to drive disclosure and management of climate risks. I mean, you notice most countries, major companies these days in their AGM are being pressured by investors to actually recognise the magnitude of the climate risks they're running and to give some evidence as to how they're being managed. The world desperately needs a long-term strategic vision that we can all rally behind. To many, this objective should be about about 9 billion plus people living well within planetary boundaries by mid-century. When I say living well, I mean that everyone's dignity and rights are respected, basic needs are met, and equal opportunities are available for all. When I talk about living within planetary boundaries, I refer to global warming stabilising at no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, where nature is protected, restored and used sustainably. It also means that societies would have developed sufficient adaptive capacity to build and maintain resilience in a healthy and regenerative Earth system. Achieving this vision is central to our ability to run our businesses profitably and generate long-term value. It is also important to remember that for business to thrive, society must survive. This requires a wholesale transformation of everything we have grown up with. Energy needs to be decarbonised, materials to become circular, food needs to be produced sustainably, equitably and provide healthy diets and so on. I am perhaps for the first time in a long time now getting quite optimistic about the future. The mood is rapidly changing among Australia's largest business groups, farmers, local government and the broader community, even across our state governments. Australian business is embracing values that are close to the history of the Business Council for Sustainable Development. They want substantial, practical, results-driven progress that will underpin sustainability. Transformation requires an unprecedented level of leadership that rejects a business-as-usual mindset and acknowledges that business can actually achieve such change if it sees itself as part of a larger whole. We must recognise that a habitable planet and an equitable society, genuinely free and fair markets and strong public institutions are all in our individual and collective self-interest. If you want to succeed in the transformation journey, you cannot achieve that without questioning the beliefs that have guided how you think about the longer term. We need to reinvent the model of capitalism that we have all grown up with so that it rewards value creation, not value extraction. Businesses must be made more resilient and adaptable to the disruptions that will inevitably lie ahead. And business knows that it must be transparent and accountable for their actions to reduce emissions, not just to shareholders, but to a broad cross-section of stakeholders in each case. There will be little support from their employees, shareholders or customers if the efforts to reduce emissions are not genuine, reportable and additional. The issue of the role of offsets is an emerging one that should not be used by business to greenwash its way out of genuine action. We must think regeneratively, moving beyond the doing no harm mindset to one that enables our social, environmental and economic systems to heal and thrive. The role of business in Australia is a particularly crucial one. We have a government that does not respect the science. That just imagine for a moment the catastrophe to our way of life, our loved ones and our livelihoods, and to our economy if the government had ignored the science about the onset of the pandemic. And the challenge with climate far outweighs the significance of the challenge from the pandemic. But they don't. The health and economic response to date has worked to ensure no one is left behind. The race to net zero is no different from the race to eradicate COVID. Now is exactly the time to, one, put aside political expediency discussions about legacy energy systems, two, to invest or to commercialise and deploy the shovel-ready carbon-neutral technologies, three, scale up and support acceleration of the current efforts of increased ambitions of state and territory governments, the corporate and finance sector, and the practical on-ground solutions by communities, especially those in our Indigenous community. And finally, we need to join with global leaders such as Biden and Johnson and renewable experts and institutions and embrace the reality that our energy system needs to transform to ensure that we are not just survive, but that we, as all Australians, thrive. The government claims the mantle of conservative, but they so readily ignore market forces and realities. I mean, if you were a genuine conservative, you'd start by putting a price on carbon. The reality is that the transitions like responding to the challenges of COVID or climate are not to be feared. They simply have to be planned and to be managed. As I said earlier, I'm encouraged by the way our behaviours change so rapidly, effectively and collaboratively in response to the COVID pandemic. So we are all change makers now, with business having to play a leading role in transformation, working together with governments, regulators, investors and all people. Our organisation, the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia, stands ready to make this happen in whatever way we can. Thank you.
Would you please now welcome to the stage Virginia Ford-Zink, Board Director of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia, to give the vote of thanks.
John, on behalf of the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia and for all our guests and members here this evening, I really would like to thank you most sincerely for such a stirring and insightful oration. I know Fiona would be humbled indeed. As you pointed out, Fiona had an absolute genuine passion for sustainability long before it had the currency it has today. For those of you who knew Fiona, she was also bold in her vision, tireless in trying to bring about change in the climate policy area through the influence of business, and fearless in her ability to speak truth to power. I think, John, you have encapsulated all of those characteristics in the speech you've just given. It's actually quite depressing to hear some of the things you had to say and to realise that Australia is such a global laggard in the climate change area. The decade that's just been was a critical one for our transformation, and at a federal level it was totally wasted, much to the detriment of us all. This coming decade is one that cannot and must not be wasted. I think, as Barack Obama said, we can all feel the absolute fierce urgency of now, and it is up to all of us, individually and businesses, to do what we can to make this a decade that really, really brings meaningful change. As an Australian, I find it embarrassing that we can be lumped together with North Korea, Brazil and Saudi Arabia as the deplorables in the climate action area. So against all of that, John, it was also interesting to hear that you're excited for the first time and you feel optimistic about the future. You sense that the mood is rapidly changing amongst Australia's large business groups, farmers, local government and the broader community. I think we can all see that evidenced in what the New South Wales state government's currently doing with its fast transformation to sustainable energy and moving away from the gas-fired nonsense Internationally, I don't know whether any of you have seen the news this afternoon, but it's also clear to see the pressure that ExxonMobil, Chevron and Royal Dutch Shell are all coming under today. There have been massive findings in the Dutch court against Global Dutch Shell to massively reduce their emissions. Shareholders are in revolt against ExxonMobil and Chevron. Investors, Wall Street are all applying massive pressure. So I think we really are at a turning point, and you picked up on that, John. Transformation takes an unprecedented level of leadership, both politically and business-wise. So, John, for the good of the country, do you think you'd have a second crack at the political career? I just think the first time round, your problem was that you were basically 30 years in front of the rest of the country. It was interesting to hear your insights into reimagining the model of capitalism that rewards value creation, not value extraction. Businesses must become more resilient to the shocks and disruptions that will lie ahead. The problem is it's difficult to accurately predict how, when and where they will occur. But I think the COVID pandemic has clearly shown how fast government, business and society can pivot if they are guided by the science and have a genuine collaborative will to do the right thing. This rapid pivot is required to meet the extraordinary challenges of focusing on meaningful government policy and business charting a new sustainable path forward. I know Fiona would be excited that we stand on the cusp of such enormous change. As you said, John, the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia is here to work with its members to help implement that change. John, once again, thank you for delivering such an outstanding, insightful and interesting oration in Fiona's memory. Thank you.
Would you please now welcome to the stage Andrew Petersen, the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia, to provide some final thoughts and close the oration.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you. A most unusual oration this year for a number of reasons, not the least of which is at least 25% of the room is actually in Melbourne at the moment. So we honour elders past, present and emerging, and also distant relatives who were going to come up for this particular oration. But the way in which we commence this oration today is just a soupçon of the way in which we think this organisation also needs to change as part of this transformation, not just because we're turning 30, but because, as both John has identified in the speech that he gave and in Virginia's thanks, the clear indication is that and I think Virginia are a little bit wrong. I think we've gone past the tipping point. I think we are now at the point of no return. Or let's put that positively, we are at a new point, a new North Star, as Peter Backer calls it, and that's the one we are heading towards. Let me, as the current CEO, acknowledge not just my immediate predecessor, as we do with this oration, but we're also extremely fortunate today to have the very first CEO of this organisation in the audience, and that is John Cole. John, would you like to stand up? A testimony to longevity that this organisation has only had 3 CEOs. I'm sure the board is very happy about that. Also, I'm delighted that there are a number of past directors and past chairs in the studio audience today. Hello, Ben Waters. Hello, Mike Lotzoff. And hello, Tony Wright. And if there's anybody there that I've forgotten and haven't seen on the way in, I do apologise. But a warm welcome to... Oh, and Mike Nichols up the back. A warm welcome to you all for coming today. Thank you so much for joining us for this oration. What I wanted to do is just give you a quick insight into the future. I recently penned a piece on LinkedIn called Come So Far and Got So Far to Go. I would like to give you a quick insight in the few minutes remaining before some of us go off to make a small cheers to the last 30 years upstairs, to give you an inkling as to what's going to be the elements of transformation of this organisation and its membership, not just over the next year and the next few years, but actually in the next few months. We are, as part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, proposing to quite radically change the way in which we welcome, accept and require membership of our organisation going forward. And this is necessary because there are new challenges, there are new issues, and there are certainly new ambitions and potentially new actions of companies that we think, as part of the BCSD, that need to be fully recognised in the work that we do with our members, but also more broadly in the work that we do with our members, with government and with other partners. So as you can see, a new benchmark for sustainable leadership through raised ambition and action. Well, you might ask, well, how? I'm glad you asked. We are introducing 5 new member criteria to the membership criteria from the 1st of July of this year. The first is a requirement that you will, and I quote, set an ambition to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions no later than 2050 and have a science-informed plan to achieve it that could include natural climate solutions and other carbon removal solutions, greenhouse gas emissions, including Scope 1, 2, but just as importantly, Scope 3. Not necessarily heroic for some companies, but an interesting challenge and an opening up of revisiting current approaches by companies in their value chains. And interestingly, one that was wholeheartedly embraced by not just the WBCSD membership in late last year, but also by our membership when we had a very thorough consultation over the last few months in relation to these conditions. The second is, and this is probably the most ambitious of all of them, interestingly enough, which is to set an ambitious policy or a science-based short and medium-term goal contribute to biodiversity recovery by 2050. Now, this is a long time coming, but in one sense it is an overnight sensation. The issue and the correlation between nature and climate is becoming implacably there for everyone to see. And the discussions and the negotiations currently going on at the UNFCCC are now embracing those with and to and around those of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity as well. They are happening almost simultaneously, they are happening collaboratively, and they are proposing to have perhaps not necessarily a combined convention on both biological diversity and climate change, but certainly a collaboration, a connectedness and a harmony between the two going forward. And next month you're going to see the launch of the equivalent of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure for Nature. And that's going to be a very interesting, in some respects challenging for companies, because they've never really thought about the interactivity or the interaction that they have with nature in their business operations. But I can guarantee you that it will be as profound, if not in fact some ways more profound than that of the TCFD. The third, which is the support of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights by having in place a policy to respect those human rights and a human rights due diligence process, for some is quite a challenge. But interestingly, right across Australia, in certainly large business, it's already becoming business as usual. And that's exciting and encouraging to see. Why? Because we have a platform in relation to human rights underpinned by the modern slavery legislation at a federal level. But there are challenges, and we're starting to see this not just in Australia but also in the United Kingdom, who's had legislation in place for some considerable time, and the monuments or the mountains of reports that are coming through don't necessarily indicate that the effectiveness of that reporting is doing any real action as a result of reporting. So that's going to be quite a challenge. Fourthly, declare support for inclusion, equality, diversity and the elimination of any form of discrimination. That and condition 3 is very much the reason why I'm so excited that Susan Moylan Coombs and her organisation has agreed to come and join with us in partnering in a consultation with our membership, not just in relation to these conditions, but broadly in relation to the platform of human and social capital that the WBCSD is looking to roll out over the next 18 months. And we want to be at the front end of that because we consider it to be an important precursor of action by business on the social front. And finally, one which for most Australian companies, at least at a publicly listed level, is not that unusual, but for others, particularly small and medium enterprise, certainly governments and philanthropy and academia, is not necessarily thought of as something that they need to do. But we're going to be encouraging them to do so, which is to operate at the highest level of transparency, either by using some form of TCFD or like reporting framework. Now, as it says down the bottom, these conditions are being proposed to help raise ambition, not to impose some sort of form of compliance, because there are, as it says in the second, there are already a number of tools out there, and we already know that there is a lot of consultation going on at the moment internationally around the potentiality of a harmonised corporate reporting framework. Even if it's not going to be a single and unified one, it will certainly be harmonised. And so this opportunity of raising up ambition by action and reporting and transparency, we consider at the BCSD to be an absolutely vital one, particularly where investors are coming knocking at their door asking for this kind of information. How are we going to do it? We're quite an unusual member of the WBCSD network because we embrace not just companies, but also private companies. We also have government, academia and philanthropy and NGOs as members. So we decided to take a two-step process. The first being that we will encourage those who are publicly listed and large to embrace the adherence to these particular reporting criteria by no later than the 1st of January 2023, and we will help those who are not in that category to opt in if they can possibly do so by that time. Again, why? Well, everybody's part of somebody's value chain these days. And so the question becomes, well, why wouldn't you do it if you are seeking to raise transparency and accountability across your key constituents and your key stakeholders? And of course, any new member that joins after the 1st of July will have those conditions as part of their criteria. And finally, we're not going to impose this for just the idleness of asking the members to do so. Far from it. There is already a structured pathway as to implementation of the way in which you will be able to, if you are a member, be supported in achieving outcomes in relation to the conditions. And so what we're announcing tonight is that we are going to have a series of activities that will support the members and the broader business community of Australia to understand how companies will actually undertake alignment with these new conditions. The first is obviously tonight, to announce that we are doing it, and we're very excited that we've been able to do this in a fairly rapid time frame compared to the WBCSD, who took, and I quote, 3 years to actually do this. Secondly, there will be a workshop on the 9th of June. It will be virtual, and it, as John indicated, will highlight these 9 pathways that the WBCSD membership have been developing now for some considerable time. And in fact, we in Australia were part of this consultation. Ironically, we did this on the 13th of December 2019 at the University of Sydney Business School. And we've been part of this regional group that have been supporting the WBCSD's development of the Time to Transform platform. So we're very excited that we're one of the first members of the network to actually have this international Australia workshop, which will be online and free for anybody to dive into and dial into. Thirdly, on the 17th of June, we will be announcing that we have been supported by the We Mean Business Coalition to rapidly undertake an Ambition 21 project. We want to have a conversation across Australia with government and business around what is the possibility of ambition greater than 26 to 28%. Not leaders are not doing enough, but rather Look at what you might be able to do. Could you do it with somebody else? Could we do it together? And so there will be an announcement around the project plan for that on the 17th of June, along with the funding support that's been given by the We Mean Business Coalition to literally go around Australia, except for Victoria, to actually have face-to-face roundtables and summits around raising ambition, and then present this as part of Australia's contribution to the We Mean Business Coalition's platform going into Glasgow at COP26. The week after that, we're not going to forget biodiversity. So we're going to have, again, an online platform across 3 days. We're calling it the Pre-COP15 Summit, the COP that everybody forgets. Well, we're going to put it front and centre. And we're delighted that the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity will actually be opening and speaking virtually at this particular summit. We're also excited that we've already lined up 20 speakers who will be talking about a variety of issues, particularly how mainstreaming biodiversity for business will look. There's been a lot of conversation over the last number of years around protection of areas and the need for the focus on protection of species, but what's the responsibility, the role, the opportunity that business plays in relation to that particular narrative? So we look forward to you joining with us on that. In FY22, the 17, which some of you may have heard, will be back. The 17 is what I call the Gras van Egmond from the Banksia Foundation and Andrew Petersen Love Fest, where we talk once a month in relation to one of the Sustainable Development Goals online with a number of guest speakers, and that'll be back in July. We'll also be continuing on with the reviews of all of our members' sustainability reports and integrated reports. So the WBCSD has a very impressive framework called Reporting Matters, which it looks at every single member's sustainability report every single year and provides them with an assessment and a report based on a very substantial and wide set of criteria and data and indices that they have gathered over the last 20 years as an organisation, and they provide this as a member service. We've been doing it for the last 3 years. We will be ramping that up in 2020, financial year 2022, because it will be part of the membership criteria that will need to be fulfilled going into 2023. And lastly, and my good friend Tony Gourley, who's in the audience, knows this, there will be a very exciting announcement that will be made, fingers crossed, by Tony, at the event on the 17th of June around a potentially exciting Climate Week conference that's happening in Australia, possibly on the 22nd of September. But I say nothing more, and you didn't see this from me. Tony will tell you more. So we're very excited about the way in which we have moved forward. We are taking the cudgel of the opportunity around these conditions to get on with it as quickly as humanly possible. Well, that's it from me. That's it from this 7th. I think I'd said it was the 6th, but it's actually the 7th Fiona Wain Oration. Thank you so much for joining us today. A personal reflection around Fiona, and this is where I start to get teary, is she was passionate, she was determined, but gosh, she was a bully. Oh, I tell you. But what a great bully she was. I'll never forget how, get Malcolm Turnbull and Fiona Wain in a room, and Malcolm came off second best, which is quite interesting, really, when you think about it. But no, we're delighted that we're able to convene this oration every year in her honour and have such great speakers such as our own chair, who I really should have thought of asking much earlier than this, to actually deliver this particular oration. But for now, thank you so much for coming today. For those of you who are joining us for the nibbles and a drink, please make your way back up to the main area, and it is the glass-fronted area that looks out over Woolloomooloo Wharf. And for those of you who aren't joining us, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Very much appreciated.